Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. In the coming decade, the nonprofit sector is set to see a massive turnover in leadership as the boomers retire. Indeed, sector experts say this trend started during the pandemic as many established leaders opted for early retirement. How can the sector be more intentional about succession planning in order to build sustainable organizations? What does it take to build a succession plan, attract more young people to the sector, and build better pipelines for recruiting boards of directors? Joining us to discuss these important issues is Nick Chambers, partner in Boyden's social impact practice. Nick recruits executives and board directors for a wide array of mission-driven and public-serving organizations. Nick is frequently called upon to lead or support searches with an equity, diversity, and inclusion focus. He's an executive in residence at the Rotman School of Management, was previously Boyden's representative on the Association for Executive Search Consultant Diversity Leadership Council, and is a faculty member for McKinsey's Black Executive Leadership Program, among many other important roles. Nick is a 2022 recipient of the AESC's Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility Award. Welcome to the podcast, Nick.
Thanks very much, Mary. Great to be with you.
Now, Senator Ratna Omidvar has indicated that this massive leadership transition and the inability to attract young people to the sector and nurture them into these roles is going to be an issue that has far-reaching impacts for the sector in the coming years. What are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, the senator is right, of course. And this is a sector where there's never been enough money. And never been enough ability to plan ahead as to where the money is going to come from, what priorities will receive ongoing funding and support. And so on one hand, the challenge that the senator has described is real and it's pressing and it's going to require new attention, different attention, some significant reorganizations and changes in the way that these organizations work. At the same time, this is a sector that is quite accustomed to seismic change, to pivoting, to reorganizing, to doing more with less. There's a management framework known as VUCA that talks about volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, and I think those are descriptions, those are experiences that the sector is quite accustomed to navigating, but some really focused attention on succession in ways that are sometimes difficult in this sector. I think that's going to be really important.
Yeah, that sounds quite daunting for leaders in these organizations and boards of directors that would be, looking to assist in the creation of a succession plan. Can you tell us what you've been seeing in terms of leadership transitions in the nonprofit sector among your clients?
Yeah, a mix. There's some who are continuing as usual, hoping to keep their leaders as long as possible and react when a change is in front of them. But as recently as yesterday or the day before, I had a call with the founding CEO of a not-for-profit who's been in the role for 10 years, has let his board know that a year from now he'll be moving on, and they're planning. They're doing. In fact, I think it's even more than maybe a year and a half from now, and they're planning for that from now. We just signed up a client who's in a very similar situation, and so I'm seeing more and more evidence of that forward planning. Of course, it requires a level of trust between the board and their most senior executives, so that that executive director, that CEO, can be open about their plans and their intentions, and can do so without fear of of the board jumping the gun and directly or inadvertently triggering an exit prematurely, and so that whether it's directly between the chair and the CEO or the CEO and the board more broadly, kind of a willingness to have courageous conversations about about what's going for what's going to happen is key.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of what I've heard referenced as the founders syndrome, where you have many organizations that really that was the the had a creator essentially, and whose baby it was for many years, and brought a community together and built an organization to deliver on its mission. And that in some respects, there's this delicate dance that happens between the boards of director and the existing executive director about, okay, what are your plans? What is the timing of this? How do we execute this? How do we even raise the subject with the existing executive director? What do you see in that regard?
Yeah. Yeah, you're right, and I'll add to your description of the phenomenon that often a board, particularly when it's worked out really well with that founding CEO, they're terrified at the notion of having to replicate that person, and on one level they realize that that no two leaders are exactly alike, but they fear their dependence on the ways in which the organization has been built around that founder, and what it would mean to have someone else at the helm. And in the way that our psyches work, we might be tempted to kick that reality down the road as long as possible. And so I used the word courageous a few minutes ago. I think it is in part a question of courage. It's also about the ability to plan ahead, and we know the best boards do planning, engage in planning really well. They plan their meetings from well in advance. They have clear accountabilities assigned at the committee level and the board level. They've got a reporting cadence that helps keep them on top of business, and in fact a step ahead whenever possible. And succession is one of those priorities that should really be baked into the rigor, the routines of a board, and then that relationship, the ability to forge an open, honest, trusting relationship that enables the kinds of conversations that we're talking about, the delicate conversations that we're talking about.
So, how can boards of directors better prepare for an executive leadership transition at their organization? What steps should they be contemplating putting in place?
Yeah, so there's some executive directors, some CEOs are on a term based contract, so they might have been signed up for a 3-year term or a 5-year term, and in anticipation of that term coming to an end and either a departure or a reappointment, there should be some conversation with that leader baked in as to what their intentions, what their plans are, and so that might kind of help point in the direction of needing to think about a replacement for that leader, or needing to think about how to hold on to that leader. And in the absence of a term limit, if it's an open contract that doesn't anticipate a specific departure date or need for reappointment, then building into that cadence of chair and CEO dialogue and planning should be a discussion of that leader's plans. That leader should also be encouraged to be thinking about the other members of their executive team, understanding what their goals, their ambitions, and aspirations are. If in doing so, the CEO determines that there's no one on the team who would naturally kind of gravitate toward stepping in as their replacement, or at least putting their name in the hat, then that should be a matter of discussion with the board. It's a risk for the organization, and so I'm going to sound like a broken record, but a lot of this does have to do with open dialogue and planning about future possibilities.
So, assuming that there is no person that's being groomed to take over that role within the organization, that's where you come in the sense of being an executive search in this space, in this sector. What should boards know about the hiring process? Do you have any best practices that you can share for the folks out there in our audience that might be sitting as a member of a board?
Yeah. So the first one, to bridge from something you said earlier in your question, even if there has been some grooming in place, it's often governance best practice to run a search, just so that you can make sure that the board has considered all of its available options, and even if the search ends up going to an internal candidate, they can speak with confidence that the decision making, the process that led to that decision making was rigorous and took into full consideration the organization's needs and the board's fiduciary responsibilities. When it comes to a search itself, search governance is really important. Often, particularly when you've got a board of more than a few people, often a search committee is struck. That's a subset of the board. The composition of that committee is going to be really important. The clarity as to what that committee is charged with, what level of autonomy versus accountability back to the board is expected. What happens when the committee comes back to the board with their recommendation? We've seen excellent search processes go off the rails when that committee comes back to the board and the board says, yeah, that's nice, but we want to interview the candidates ourselves. That's not a best practice. The board wants to be clear enough to the search committee as to what their expectations are. And again, the leeway that the committee has, and then they need to trust the committee to do that work. And when the committee comes back to the board, they need to be clear about what they did, how they did it, what kinds of metrics they can report back on in terms of the reach of the search, the types of candidates, the diversity of the candidate pool, the efforts that they took to ensure as inclusive a process as possible. So that search governance piece is really important. How to manage the transition from the outgoing to incoming leader, that's really important and requires some forward thinking. How best to ensure an inclusive and equitable search, and the ways in which you're going to hold the recruitment firm accountable for the practices that they engage in, and the ways in which they support that candidate pool and the search committee. That will be really important. And how best to engage external stakeholders and internal stakeholders in the process will also be key. There are a lot of people internally who may be concerned about their jobs, may be concerned about how the decision is being made, don't want to be left completely in the dark. So, these searches are almost always confidential in terms of the identities of the people being considered, but there are aspects of the process and the progress that's being made that that committee and or board should be communicating back to internal folks so that they feel that they're being brought along in the process.
You raised a really interesting point that I think is worth addressing a little further. And in a sense, even if one has a succession plan and presumably somebody more junior than the departing leader, they've been groomed potentially by that leader, and may well be the choice of that leader. So, when you look at the board's role in terms of who they choose as the leader of the organization once that person transitions, they do have a fiduciary duty to the organization and not to the leader or to the person who's been groomed to take over that role. And I really would love to hear more about your thoughts around the fiduciary duty of the board to the organization and the charity or the charity itself.
Yeah, it's it's often said that the most important role of a board is hiring the CEO, and the work that happens after you've hired that CEO to make sure that that CEO has the tools and resources and support to do their work. And it's a bit of a balancing act. So on one hand, and I think we might talk about this later, the retaining people. Part of the task of retaining people is to ensure that they feel that they belong in the organization, can grow in the organization values them, and even if they don't spend their entire career with that organization, that there is a path forward for them. And particularly for smaller organizations or ones in which there's not a lot of movement, development planning around what's next for someone is really key is key. And so on one hand, you might have someone on the executive team who says, my ambition, my goal is to be the CEO of an organization, and I would love for it to be this one, and might be turning to the CEO for some coaching, or sometimes members of the board will step in and provide some coaching or mentoring happens elsewhere. So we want to be doing those types of things while at the same time ensuring that the board has full opportunity to pick the person they deem to be best for the CEO role. And I think most up and coming executives recognize that reality. They recognize that even if the CEO has said, "I see potential in you to step into this role when I'm gone," that there's no guarantee that's going to happen. And so one of the very pragmatic questions we're asked is, when a decision is made to conduct a search to replace a CEO, in what ways should that CEO be involved in the search? And the best answer to that question is we should get their advice. We should give them as much opportunity as we can to help the search firm and the search committee understand current context and future challenges and opportunities. But then it's over to the board to make the decision. And most CEOs have a pretty sophisticated understanding of those dynamics. Some have a hard time pulling away. and may have good reason to try and stay as close to it as possible. And but ultimately, you want to make sure that the decision making is happening um, in the right places by the right people.
And that would be the board.
That would be the board.
And and after the new leader is actually hired, what should boards be doing to help support them and set them up for success in their new role?
So I'm a big fan of the transition team model. So if you think of when a new mayor is elected, and there's that period of time um, where they're getting up to speed. They are establishing their 30, 60, 90-day plans. They are getting the lay of the land. They are meeting folks, establishing relationships, um, perhaps gaining insight into sensitive, confidential matters that hopefully there was an opportunity during the search process to shed some light on those things, but there may be some new ground to be covered, or hypersensitive ground to be covered, um, uh, and they're starting to formulate whether it's planned for their first series of town halls or other communications. And so to surround that new leader with a team who's going to help guide them on those various fronts, making introductions, orienting them to providing that lay of the land, coaching. It's often said that it's lonely at the top. We want to minimize the extent to which that's the case, and we certainly don't want a new leader kind of feeling lost in the woods in that transition period. We have a great leadership consulting practice here at Boyden, and one of the services that we offer is to take the leadership team through some assessments that help to surface things like working styles, communication styles and preferences, and kind of majors and minors in terms of people's skill sets, and then bringing the team together to help the team understand the ways in which they might need to adapt or consider the characteristics of their colleagues in how they work. And so appointing a new leader can be a great time to do that kind of assessment, reflection, and forming.
And what should boards understand when they're potentially bringing on their first leader of color or a leader from another equity deserving group? What kinds of challenges do these leaders face? And should the board be doing things differently to support these executives?
Yeah, yeah. I love that question. There's a phrase that's sometimes used, the curse of the first. We're great at celebrating the first woman leader of X, Y, and Z, or the first racialized person in a given role, and there's a sense of excitement that comes with perhaps achieving something that hasn't been achieved before, breaking new ground, perhaps. There's a certain kind of optimism associated with what that might mean for the future of the organization. I mentioned that it can be lonely at the top. I think it can be especially lonely at the top when you're the first. And sometimes boards or other hiring bodies can make the mistake of thinking that the job is now done. Of placing too much on the shoulders of that new person in terms of taking over long-standing issues of microaggression, sexism, discrimination, distrust between groups or individuals within an organization, and so we need to so as to what to do about it. First of all, the board needs to realize that the job is not done once there's one. Um, uh, uh, and in the meanwhile, while there is only one, or while there, while there's still work to do in further diversifying the team, um, there should be some really open dialogue with that person, a willingness to say, how's it going so far? What are you finding difficult? Um, I want you to help co-design your experience here. There is a risk in all of this that we take a more patronizing approach that says, I've heard of the curse of the first, and so I'm going to make it easy for you, and I'm going to clear roadblocks and introduce you to all kinds of folks who are going to mentor you. And while those steps, at least some of those steps, may be the right steps to head down that path without having that leader kind of join in with you lockstep, would also be a mistake. So the co-designing the onboarding experience, co-designing the steps that need to be taken to kind of share the load as far as the organization's needs are concerned. That'll really be really important. And maybe the last thing I'll add on this is that while we like to talk about the value of failing fast and learning from our failures, I can pretty much guarantee you that person who stepped into the role and as the first ever is doesn't believe that there's room to fail, either for their own sake or for the sake of others who would hope to follow them. And so to recognize that and have open dialogue about that, I think, is really important.
Yeah, that's so well said, and certainly nobody, as much as success, they say, is always about getting up once you've fallen down, and to continue to do so. It doesn't feel very good when you fall down or have been pushed down. So that is a very, I think, nuanced and a very thoughtful response. I wonder if we could turn to, when it comes to succession planning for the board itself. And we've talked a lot on this podcast about the diversification of boards of directors and how important that is. What could be done to properly prepare and recruit new directors, and potentially even with the goal of having more diverse members of the board?
So there's a lot that can be done, and a lot of boards have made progress on this front. So I'll kind of put on the table the concept of the skills matrix. There's been a lot of debate as to whether we should use them at all, how we should use them. The kind of most traditional stereotypical version of the skills matrix was a list that says we need a lawyer, we need an accountant, we need an HR person, etc. Yeah, we've got one of each of those. We're good to go. And the approaches to looking at the composition of the board and planning ahead, given strategic needs, given governance needs, given stakeholder relations needs, and as we move, as more and more boards adopt term limits, kind of knowing that in 2 years we're going to have, these particular vacancies, because we have surveyed our board to understand what skills, perspectives, identities, relationships we have around the table. Because we've done that work, and we've mapped it, and we know who's going to be leaving in 2 years, then we can start to plan ahead around what we need. That kind of definition of needs to be flexible enough to be opportunistic. Sometimes there are people who come along who don't fit neatly into what we've anticipated, um, or what our mapping captures. But we have other reasons to believe that they would be a great addition to the board. So there needs to be a little bit of room for that kind of opportunistic hiring, if you'd like. But at least 80% of that work should be about kind of rigorously assessing who we have, who's missing currently, who's going to be missing as the board, as the organization embarks on a new strategic direction, or as challenges in the funding environment or the government relations environment, or perhaps we are heading toward a partnership that would require, a different set of skills or perspectives around the board. It's often the governance and nominations committee or equivalent to that that's charged with keeping their eyes on this work, and then I think the other thing that we're seeing boards wrap their heads around is the need to assess incoming board members. So traditionally, particularly for volunteer board positions, there's been a bit of a mindset that says, if we can land so and so, man, would we be lucky. And so rather than ensuring that so and so is interested for reasons that matter to us, ensuring that they in fact have the skills and the capacity and the other requirements to do the work, we've tended to roll out the red carpet and woo them and not want to impose on them anything that feels like an interview. And so I think the boards who do this best strike a balance between paving the way for the opportunity, while also ensuring that they're getting in that person what they think they're getting, and what the organization needs.
Right. So you're not just recruiting for skills, but you've kind of described a scenario where you might be recruiting for a person's connections or access to potential funders, for example. And is that the right criteria, and making sure that we understand what the right criteria is for the makeup of the board? Is that what I understand you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And so related to that, I think anyone who has served on a board would recognize the scenario where you've brought in someone sensational, someone excellent, and then you barely see the person. And so, there are questions of commitment and motivation and capacity, in addition to capabilities, that need to be considered in that process.
Are there any tools or suggestions that you might have to help boards who might be involved in efforts to improve diversity and inclusion at the board level?
Yeah, there are lots of different resources out there. Lots of people who over the last number of years have developed some specialization, some real skills in supporting boards and doing that work. And part of the work is about level setting, gaining some real clarity as to what diversity and inclusion mean, broadly speaking, but also what they mean specifically to this organization and where they are on their journey. The types of experts, facilitators, consultants I'm thinking about will also challenge the board to think beyond optics, if that's where the board is, to help them really think through what representation means to them. And so I'll tell you a quick story. There's a friend of mine who's a wonderful board member and chair, and early on his board journey, um, and has a long career as an executive, lots and lots to offer to a board. So joins the board, and about a year or a year and a half in, is at an event where the board chair points to this friend of mine and says, one of the things that we really value about having this person around the board is his relationships in the South Asian community. And he kind of does one of these to look to see if that chair might have been pointing to someone else, because while this friend of mine is in fact from that part of the world and is himself South Asian, he would tell you he could easily name off several people who have much better relationships, and in fact, even further. This was the first time that he was hearing that was something that they were looking for from him, or value from him. And to me, that's a really clear example of the difference between thinking about representation from at a surface level versus representation that comes with it, relationships and an interest in helping that organization deepen their relationships in a given community. So, let's be really thoughtful about if who that organization is serving and the ways in which the board is intended to help. And so, and that might help us decide that we need someone with lived experience of mental illness, because that's the nature of the work that we do and the types of communities that we engage in, and we want the board to help us, strengthen those types of relationships, versus representation or relationships around newcomers or youth or indigenous communities. So some really kind of clear, some clarity around why diversity matters to us, and the ways in which we want our board as a whole and individual members to contribute to that.
Yeah, the presumption that was in that observation that you describe your friend experiencing must have been a bit of a shocker, and obviously it would be one thing if he was aware that was what the expectation was, versus just having that assumption being made or the presumption being made. I'm curious now, in closing, whether you feel optimistic that, we've talked about this big gap that we see looming in this leadership transition as the boomers depart. Are you feeling optimistic that nonprofits will be able to meet these challenges and create a stronger sector? What do you see as what the sector will look like in 5 years from now? How do you think that these organizations are going to get through what could be conceived of as quite a crisis in leadership?
Oh, if only I had such a crystal ball. So whether the question is one of progress along diversity lines, whether the question is one of financial sustainability, whether, we know that at the same time that a lot of the things that we've discussed are happening, the donor profile is changing, as the types of folks who would have in the past written big checks and could be depended on for charitable giving, as that profile is changing, some of those folks are aging and moving on. And as competition for philanthropic dollars increases, so I predict that there will be increased instability. I don't expect that governments will, out of the blue, start throwing lots more money into the sector. I can anticipate an increased need for partnerships. Some organizations will fold or will fold into other organizations. We might see kind of more merging. We might see operating models kind of upended, and organizations try something new. If I'm to look for a silver lining in that, I think there's real opportunity for leaders who are entrepreneurial, leaders who can help navigate change, who, we like to talk about builders, but people who can lead change, who can bring others along, who can spot opportunities. I love, one of my favorite management books is The Opposable Mind by Roger Martin, who talks about kind of in the face of what seemed to be diametrically opposed or mutually exclusive options, there's a certain type of leader who's actually able to see the yes and instead of only seeing the either or. I think there'll be an increased need for that. We talk a lot, throw around the word resilience a lot, and I think there's a need not only for leaders who are themselves resilient, but who can help nurture resilience in others. So I think it's going to be a rocky next 5 years, and unsettling, destabilizing for a lot of people, but an opportunity for the type of leadership that can help kind of navigate that kind of terrain.
That's so interesting. I've heard something similar from other experts I've spoken to in that regard, related to merging and creating partnerships, and how that might well be one of those, I guess, antidotes to be more resilient and respond to the challenges. Nick, this is such an important challenge for nonprofit organizations to address, for their continued resilience of the organization, but also the sector. Thank you for your insights and advice, and thank you for joining us at CharityVillage Connects.
My pleasure. I appreciate what you folks are doing with this series, and the ways in which you are fueling the sector with insights and sharing of knowledge, and I've been pleased to be involved. So thank you.
Well, that's exactly what we're trying to do with the podcast, and so we really appreciate your contribution to that. So thank you again.
My pleasure. Take good care.